Well, good evening, everybody. It's always a sort of hazardous moment when your former colleagues introduce you. It's a bit like being introduced by your wife. They know a little bit too much. But Tony, you were very generous in your remarks, so I'll save my retaliation till later. It is actually true that when you leave a business like Asda, which was in its time very successful, half of you wants it to fall over. Because when you're gone, you think it can't possibly carry on without me. And the other half of you hopes it'll go on and be even more successful. Of course, in the case of Asda, Tony took over after a short interlude and made it far more successful than it was in my time. And it was under Tony's era that it became the best employer in Britain and achieved all these wonderful things, not mine, although I sometimes fudge the dates just to keep people confused. It's a great pleasure to see you all here. One of the things I learned, I went into politics in 1997, just at the time when the Conservative Party went down to the worst electoral defeat for over a century. And I learned then to travel anywhere for an audience. And in fact, there are more people in this room than there were in the entire Parliamentary Conservative Party in 1997. So it's a great pleasure and thrill to see you all here, and also to have the opportunity to thank our sponsors, NatWest Bank. I suppose it's NatWest, not National Westminster. I don't know what happened to Royal Bank of Scotland, but you'll be able to tell us about that later. Now, I wanted to say a few words about the subject of today's discussion, which is leading in challenging times. And I think I'm so modestly qualified to do so, partly because I've been around for so long that I can remember when times were challenging, which some of you probably won't, but partly also because I have, as Tony has alluded to, spent most of my career specialising in failure. So I started off with Woolworth, which was then Woolworth Holdings before it became Kingfisher in 1986. It's a business that made a loss. As you probably detected, it made a loss again a year or two ago and no longer exists, but never mind, we had a good period in between. I went to Asda on December the 10th, 1991. I'll tell you about that later. I joined the Conservative Party in 1997, just as we set off into the wilderness to concentrate on losing 3 successive elections. I joined the board of British Rail. That's a whole interesting experience. If you want to ruin a good dinner party, just say you're on the board of British Rail. It's absolutely the worst board I was ever part of. Completely appalling. And I know we grumble about the railways as national pastime, but they actually they did become better after privatisation. It's unpopular thought, but they did. And then in 2002, I took over this company, Energis, which is another story. It's a telecoms business, so it's not as easy to relate to as Asda, but it's a very interesting story because it was a FTSE 100 company. It was capitalised at £8 billion in 1999, and 2.5 years later was in administration and really finished. And incidentally, never ever made a profit. At Energis, we didn't make profits. We make what the private equity sector call profits. It's something called EBITDA. We concentrate on EBITDA, which meant we never made any money, but we could say we did. And anyway, we bought Energis on the behalf of the creditor banks, one of which was the Royal Bank of Scotland, our greatest supporter, and sold it again 3 years later for double the value we paid, and managed to get all the creditors their money back, which is a success of a kind, I guess. I now have to, in order to earn a living, I have to commute 22,000 miles to Australia. There doesn't seem to be any employment for me here anymore, to work with Coles, which is, Coles is about the size of Sainsbury's, and it's a completely decrepit, well, I shouldn't say that, but it was a completely decrepit retailer until we bought it a year ago for $21 billion, and there's a team out there, partly of former Asda colleagues, who are turning it around, and it will be a very exciting story, particularly if you're Australian. I did want to say, because Tony alluded to this question of MPs' expenses, and I know that you're all longing to ask me later on exactly what I claimed. And I should point out, if you're really fascinated by this, because they've published 5 years backlog of MPs' expenses, you can look mine up, and I encourage you to do so. Because I was very dismayed by the episode of MPs' expenses, very, very disappointed, because my expense forms were always completed by my wife. And as a consequence, I said to the other day, I had no idea I could have claimed for all these things. I missed out on a lot of things in my time in politics. I certainly missed out on the money. And I'm thinking of submitting a retrospective claim. They got all the furnishings that I never claimed for. Anyway, we do live in challenging times. The question is, what do we mean by that? And before talking about management, I just wanted to talk about where do we think we really are? What's the nature of the problems that we face in this country without wanting to get into the macroeconomics too far? The nature of recession is that it ends. All recessions end. Technically, recessions come to an end when you recover the level of GDP that you had going in. And if you look at past recessions, and these graphs are past 4 recessions, you'll see that around about 4 quarters is the typical duration of recession. And if you actually take the Bank of England forecast or the Treasury forecast or independent forecast of the current recession, technically it will follow roughly this pattern. So we think of each recession as unique, and in many ways the causes are unique, but the timing is typically similar. And when people talk about green shoots, or they talk about coming out of recession in the 4th quarter, I think that will happen technically. It doesn't mean we'll feel like it's happening, but the statisticians will say that it's happening. And of course, Gordon Brown will say it's happening because he wants to declare victory in the first part of next year before declaring a general election, which won't be a victory. But that's another story. So recession doesn't last forever. And in a way, it's not the recession that matters, although we are in a relatively deep recession. It's where it leaves us subsequently. It's also true that I'm constantly struck as I go around the country and talk to different businesses that many of the parts of the country aren't really in recession. So if you talk to banks or house builders or people in the construction and building supplies industry, there's a deep recession. If you talk to some recruiting companies, there's a deep recession. But every time I see my former colleague Justin King's smiling face on television, I'm reminded of the fact there's no recession at Sainsbury's. In fact, food retail, if you take it in aggregate, has probably just had one of its best years of the decade. So recession isn't something that it never strikes the whole economy uniformly. There's always this scatter. This is actually statistic from taking the amplitude of decline and duration of decline for different sectors for the last recession. But it's always like this, and it's always partial, and the parts of the economy that are still doing quite well. So when we talk about challenging times, it's a pretty mixed picture. I'm also struck that when you go around the country, in many parts of the country, this doesn't feel like a recession. So if I walk down Oxford Street, as I did this afternoon on the way to catch the train, you would never guess there was a recession. The restaurants of London are still packed. And the consumer is in a very interesting position because technically the consumer economy isn't actually in that bad shape at the moment. So if you take the average household, the amount of money available for discretionary spending after utility bills and housing bills and essential expenses is actually up this year by around 4.8%. Now, that's taking an average household, it's not taking the totality of households. So unemployment is up, so we're talking about people in employment. And we're talking about people who live in a normal owner-occupied house with a mortgage. So when you think about it, the mortgage costs, if you're on a tracker mortgage, as low as they've ever been. And the mortgage benefit flows straight into the pocket. Last year, fuel and utilities bills and council tax was going up quite rapidly. Now they've come back down. If you count those necessities, that's gone back into the consumer pocket. Most people are still in work. In fact, the increase in unemployment has not been as great to date as people expected, and is not nearly as great to date as it is currently expected. In other words, most of the increase in unemployment is still to come. So in a way, the consumer economy isn't too bad. And that leads you to say, well, why do we feel that things are so much worse than they really are? And of course, what is happening is consumers are starting to save. That we've been through this extraordinary period when consumers are continuously spending faster than their increase in income. That's coming to an end. The savings rate has jumped up by 4.5% in the last year, which is the first significant increase for a very long period of time. And consumers are being rational. They're saying, we know it's uncertain times, we're worried about the house price, worried about employment, so we're going to be saving a bit more and we're going to be down trading, and hence the flight to value. See, the problem, therefore, to my eye, if you take the generality of the economy, depending on where you sit within it, isn't the recession. The problem is the aftermath. Because what we're going to inherit is the twin deficits. And this is what I call, when I talk to company chairmen, people in the Treasury and so on, I think you can skirt round and round it. And people will accuse you of pessimism or optimism. But there's what I call the inescapable arithmetic, which is the twin deficits. We have more consumer debt than we have ever had in the history of statistics. And if you look at this graph on your left-hand side, the blue, dark blue bars is consumer debt. The light blue is primarily corporate debt. Corporate debt isn't that high. Corporate Britain isn't over-leveraged. The consumer is over-leveraged. And incidentally, there's no other country in the world other than the United States that has this level of consumer debt. Now, a big part of it is mortgage, home equity. But of all mortgage lending in the last few years, about a third has gone into equity release and therefore into spending. Now, that has got to come to an end. Eventually, it has to come to an end. And if the consumer continues to save, the impact of this on GDP growth is very significant. And clearly, it cannot continue forever. And then on the right-hand side, we all know about the public deficit. Our public deficit outside of the really crippled countries like Ireland and so on is higher than any other developed country in the world, again, except for the United States. So the Treasury forecast is for 12.5% of GDP for the public sector borrowing requirement next year. That is generally thought to be a very optimistic forecast. So we're probably looking at something like 14% of GDP. That is higher than at any time since the Second World War. And of course, what it means, and you don't have to be a macroeconomist to figure it out, is national debt will increase by 14%. So total government borrowings will increase by 14%. And they'll increase by at least 10% again the following year. So the national debt will rise continuously. The inescapable arithmetic is this has to come down. And it doesn't matter whether you're Conservative or Labour, or in the States it's Obama. All governments know this has to come back to a sustainable level. Sustainable level is probably nearer 5%, so we're looking at 8 to 9% of GDP reduction, which has to come out of tax increases and public spending reductions. And that's why it's the aftermath that matters, that we're entering now an era of sustainable spending, public spending reductions, increased taxation, and more modest consumer spending growth. And we better get used to it, because that's life to come. And it's not going to be a year or two, it's going to be a decade. In fact, in my book, if you think about it, it's the last 10 years that was abnormal. Every year since 1992, the consumer has increased their spending faster than their increase in income, hence the rise in debt. That's not going to continue anymore. So over 1% of GDP every year is in effect being fueled by consumer leverage. That's not going to continue anymore. That was a highly unusual period. We've been in this sort of benign decade when we could all borrow more, governments could borrow more, and it didn't seem to matter very much. We're now at the end of that, and it's going to reverse. And the unavoidable arithmetic means higher taxation. The basic rate of income tax will increase. VAT will increase. And we will have a top rate of 50 or 1%, and that won't go away, not for some years to come, whatever we think about it. So we better get used to this. We're now back to normal, but normal in this country is slower growth. It's a landscape change. It's not a blip. So one of the things I find an awful lot is you get in business, people say we're trying to figure out when the recovery is going to come. When's it going to turn around? When it's going to come back? I think that's a very unhealthy piece of psychology, because it means everybody's doing their budgets with their little sort of hockey stick, market's going to come back next year. Much better to say this is permanent. Let's assume it's permanent and plan to grow share and grow our profits from here. And then if there is such a thing as a recovery, which in some sectors there will be and some you get it roughly right. But the psychology of waiting for the recovery is a very bad idea. We're into a permanently different sort of landscape. So what does the future hold? Well, it's what I call running up the down escalator. Now, what is normal? Normal, in most normal economies, are where for most businesses your costs go up faster than demand. Why? Because typically wages go up faster, not slower than consumer spending. And that's what it's going to be like. Costs are going to rise faster than demand. Therefore, success depends on productivity growth and growing market share in markets that are not growing very rapidly. And I think we have today, in many industries, there's a generation of young managers and chief executives and entrepreneurs who just got used to a different climate and are waiting for it to come back, and it won't come back. Those of us who are a bit longer in the tooth can remember what I've started my career in the 1970s, and so it was rather gratifying to know that we might be relevant again. It's all sort of coming back to where it was. So leading in this era is, in my view, not, it's not glum. It's just this is what it's going to be like. We shouldn't get depressed about it. There will be great success stories. There'll be opportunities, but it's not going to be very easy. It's what Dickens called, it's not the best of times, it's not the worst of times. And there are hard lessons to be learned. And therefore, my message to you all and to managers today is let's get back to building great businesses. Let's go back to doing the things that are necessary to turn around and forge great companies, because that's going to be more important than ever before. And there's nothing magic about managing something in a slow growth era. It's about doing better the things that you would have done anyway and not assuming that it's going to land in your lap. And so I just want to talk us through some of what those things to me consist of. And these are born of my experience in going into businesses that are struggling or have failed and on their uppers. And I wanted to start with time and place. You see, this comes back to my message about assuming it's a landscape change, not a blip. The getting time and place right is very important. That when you start in a business, you behave differently. And when I say to chief executives today is, remember your first day. Remember what you did when you were new. Behave like a new chief executive. New chief executives are radical. They listen. They set out the plan. They think about the 5 years and how we're going to change things. Once you've been there 3 or 4 years, you become a prisoner of your own past. You stop being radical. You stop grasping the nettles. You've got a history of appointments that you maybe shouldn't have made, of investments that haven't turned out so well, and you don't want to jettison. So the first thing is let's pretend, just imagine this is your first day at work. And it's always, you think about your first day, and I can remember that my first day in every job I've done, and they haven't all been very good either. I remember in going to Asda on December the 10th, 1991, and as Tony said, he wasn't meant to say this, I thought it was a great accolade to become chief executive of a FTSE 100 company at the age of 37. I was thrilled to get the job. And it wasn't until afterwards I discovered I'd been standing in a queue of one. There was nobody else. And I left my previous job with finance director of Kingfisher the previous night. And there was a farewell drinks party and spotted handkerchiefs came out. And I had my suitcase packed and I went down to King's Cross to catch the train up to Leeds, because that's where we're based. I'd never been to Leeds before. I'd been recruited by the non-executives. I'd never met anybody at Asda. So this is kind of a big thing for me, and it's like going to a new place, new company, didn't know much about it. And of course all the trains were delayed, as they always are on these occasions, and King's Cross was packed, and finally I got on a train heading north and got my suitcase on. It was absolutely packed, and we were all cheek by jowl, and I was sitting at a table with 4 people. And the great thing about this country is nobody talks on trains unless things go wrong, and then they all start chatting to each other. So I just wanted to sort of think about the next day, but the train went off and everybody was chatting away, and they asked about this or that, and I sort of ignored them. I hid behind the Financial Times. I've never read the Financial Times in such detail before. Hid around the Financial Times. So we went up north and we passed through Peterborough and so on. And then people were saying, well, where are you going? Because they'd all got diverted. And somebody said to me, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to Leeds, actually. Oh, they said, what are you going to be doing there? And I said, well, I'm going to be starting a new job. So they said, oh, that's interesting. Who with? So I said, I'm going to be joining Asda. And they all sort of looked down at their feet and shuffled as if that was rather embarrassing. And I was a bad person, so that was fine. And I went back to the Financial Times, went up through Grantham and Newark. And then the lady opposite me leaned across the table and she said, I expect you'll be on the fruit and vegetables side. So I said, well, no, not exactly, and turned the page of the newspaper, and I thought I was probably going to get away with this. Anyway, on we go up north, and the train is trundling into the station, and I think this is fine, I've got away. And as the train draws into the station, I stand up and I get my suitcase out of the rack above, and the lady turns to me and she says, well, what will you be doing? So I pull the suitcase out of the rack and put it down. As I turn round to scamper out of the carriageway, I say, I'm going to be the new chief executive. And I run out onto the platform. And I look up at this window, and the four faces there looking at me as I'm completely mad. And the train draws out of the station. And I pick up my suitcase, I look at the gantry, and it says, Doncaster. So it wasn't a very auspicious beginning, and it sort of got worse from there, because the next day I turn up at work, and I had the finance team, as before Tony arrived, of course. I had the finance team in. The finance director was there, and I had a difficult conversation with him because I had to say, well, we're not going to be working together very long, and that didn't go very well, and. And then I asked about the forecast for the year, and they said, well, we're going to run out of money by September. So I said, well, we just had this emergency rights issue. We can't run out of money. And they said, well, that's what it is. So I rang my wife and I said, look, don't move up yet, because I think I'm going to be coming down soon. Anyway, that was, Asda was a broken business then. And when you come into a broken business, and a lot of businesses now feel like a failure. But partly because we've had this era of extraordinary success, they feel like a failure. The first thing to do with people is to tell it as it is. Because for years in businesses today, and to businesses have failed, the management have sort of perpetuated a sort of myth. It's going to come all right. And the people on the front line are suffering the reality. If you're running a store, then you know whether it's working or not. And it's the generals back in staff headquarters who keep telling you it's all going very well, really. And they tell the city it's going very well, because one of our problems with public company arenas, we never want to face into the harsh reality. And so the first thing to do is to get to the front line and tell it as it is. And at Asda, what we did was we told people internally that this was a broken business and no change was not an option. And we were going to have to cut our costs. We were going to have to close stores. We made 5,000 people redundant in my first year. We sold all our future pipeline of development because we couldn't afford it. And we told people we were going to do that. And then I went to see the shareholders. And I had a chairman who was a great man called Patrick Gillam, who'd spent a career as managing director of BP. BP have 7 managing directors, don't ask me why. And anyway, at BP, nothing ever went really wrong. So he wasn't quite used to this sort of thing. But we went to see the shareholders, and we used to sit round the table. And I used to say to them, we've got a big problem. It's going to take at least 5 years to turn around. I can't promise you any improvement in profit or dividend for the next 3 years. And Patrick used to pass me under the table little bits of folded up paper. And I'd open them under the table. And it'd always say the same thing. It said, Can't you be more upbeat? And I used to say, no. He said, that's the wrong idea. They want to hear. The people on the front line and your shareholders want to hear that you know this is a big problem. They want to hear a chief executive who is, if anything, tougher, harder, and more pessimistic than he needs to be, because then you know he's going to grasp the nettle. They don't want the guys coming in to say it's going to be all right, really. And in fact, the shareholders loved it, and they respond to it, and people on the front line thought, people in our stores thought, at last, somebody's recognised, we've got a problem. Of course, when I went into the Conservative Party, it was rather different, because most of the people... Because in politics, you don't appoint your people. You get the people God and the electorate send you. And in 1997, when I became Deputy Chairman and Chief Executive of the party, the people we had were the people who had primarily populated the last government. So they were quite certain that they were right and the electorate had made a tragic mistake. And it took us 8 years to figure out that practically maybe the electorate had a point as well. But that's another thing. So time and place. First thing is recognise where you are, tell people on the front line, tell your stakeholders, set out a journey, give yourself enough time. Instant change is no change. To changing companies takes time. And if it's not 3 to 5 years, you're not trying, you won't achieve it. And more, there's time and time again, you see people, Marks and Spencer, a classic example, where people want to come in and declare victory after 2 years. It doesn't work like that. And unless you seize that moment at the very beginning to give yourself that time and set out the journey, then you won't do it. And people will follow you, in my experience, anywhere, as long as they know you've got a purpose, you've got a direction, you mean what you say, you recognise their plight, and eventually you're going to get to the sunny uplands. Second thing is bury the dead. We all have legacy problems. All businesses do. Now's the time to bury them. In retail parlance, every business, every retailer, you have 200 stores, about 10 of them every year is dying. That's just the nature of things. Locations move, towns die, towns move on, etc. But it always costs you money to close the dying stores. The trouble is they hold the whole business back. It's easy when businesses actually lose cash, but that's unusual. But your decaying tail, the problem of the business that isn't really working, the subsidiary that doesn't really perform, absorbs disproportionate time and energy. Now's the time to recognise that and to bury the dead. And, at Coles, we have 700 supermarkets. We will close, sell, or depart company with 10% of those in our first 18 months. And it's the right thing to do. Values to die for. At Asda, we always talked about values, and you get values-based businesses today, and you open annual reports, don't you? You open annual reports, and inside it has mission statements or values. And half the time, I always play this trick. If you open an annual report, it's got some value statement. It's 90% of the time completely motherhood. And some of them even put in sort of growing our earnings per share or something, if that's a value. It's not, it's just an outcome. My test is if you cross out the company name and put Cadbury Schweppes, does it still work? 9 times out of 10 it does. Values aren't what the directors think. It's what your people in the business think. It's what the people in your business who work for you think your business ought to be. Why is the community, the society, Britain a better place because of your business? And why do I want to be part of it? And if you can't articulate that, then you're going to have a real tough job persuading people that you're any better place to work than anywhere else. Because today, young people especially want to work for something more than a wage. They want to believe that what they're doing is something which they feel proud to be part. They can explain to the neighbours, the friends and the family why it's a good thing to be part of Asda or Coles or wherever it is. And I think it really matters. The days of the wage slave are over, even in recession. And the fact is that people no longer come to work just to earn a daily crust. And if you, like me, and I'll explain this later, if you think that the key to business success is to do with people, motivation and productivity, then this really matters. Now, don't think what we've done in far too many businesses, retailing especially, is we've tried to reduce the people element of the businesses. We've tried to commoditize them. So, we have lots of part-time people, we have staff rotas, we have de-skilled things, so any old fool can do the job, so you don't have to train people anymore. And all of that is, in a way, to me, yesterday's music. Now, actually, today is about making jobs more rewarding, more interesting, more skilled, more craft-based, and harnessing the motivation and competing through the motivation of your people. And the starting point for that is having a set of values, a reason why you can say as an employer, come and be part, it's tough times, I can't pay you a lot more money, there's not going to be a bonus, come and work for my business anyway, and be proud about it. Next thing, people changing means changing people. Tony referred to the fact that earlier at Asda we built up a group of outstanding young chief executives who now are scattered to the four winds leading other businesses. Some of them represented in this room. And that wasn't something we set out to do. We didn't set out to populate Britain's management pool. What we set out to is get smart people who wanted to work with us and who shared our values and shared our attitude. But I think now most businesses are actually laying people off or not hiring. My rule is you need to be hiring as many people as you're losing or more. So don't stop hiring just because we're in a recession. This is the time to build the talent pool. And this is the time to manage performance. At least 10% of your people will not be performers or will not have the right attitude. Now's the time to make that change. It's harder because you don't have the natural attrition that you would have done, but it's more important and it's a competitive opportunity. If you're in the financial services business now I'm an advisor to Lazard, fantastic time to recruit people. It's a once in a lifetime to get all those investment bankers who are at Lehman Brothers or Merrill Lynch or wherever and get them to come on board. This is a moment when you can really exploit the people pool. And if you have a better reason to come and work in make it a better place to work, they'll come on board. And the key, of course, as it always is to recruit attitude. And I always recruit attitude. I want smart people with attitude. And if you get the right attitude, because your attitude is what will build your culture. You recruit the wrong people, you'll never, ever build a special culture. At Asda, in my early years, I spent more time recruiting than almost any other single thing. At Coles, I interview people every week, even though I'm the other side of the world. It's getting a smart team in there and getting the right people is absolutely critical. And incidentally, my other great tip, and I can say this with some authority, is don't think you'll recruit all successes. My golden rule is, of every 5 people I recruit, and I've recruited thousands of people, 1 will be an outstanding success. 1 will be a complete failure, and there will be dispersion in between. So what's the challenge? The challenge isn't to think that you're going to recruit all smart people. The challenge is to recognize the ones you recruited that failed. And I hold the all-time record, because Tony's probably forgotten this, but I recruited a director of marketing, and I parted company with him the day he arrived. And you may say, well, that's an absolute catastrophic mistake, how embarrassing, which it is. And it was a catastrophic mistake, and I can see I just made a bad decision. But actually, the best decision I ever made was to say to him at the end of the day, I don't think this is working. And we just agreed that he never joined us. This just did not appear on his CV. But that's what happened. The people you recruit, a proportion with failure, keep moving them out. This is the time to build the management population. When I went to Energis, we had 2,500 people. When I left, we had 1,600. This was 3 years later. We recruited 800 people. So we replaced half, because we were changing the company, of what we had left. And we left with the best management team in telecoms, and they're now running cable and wireless. Productivity. We're now in an era where we can't afford cost increases anymore. That's gone. Demand is flat, so productivity matters. And I think we got into a time where we're used to spending money. You know, capital expenditure budgets have been great. We opened new stores, we built new facilities, we invested in new technology. That period is now over, and cost reduction, in future, most of us businesses have reduced cost in the last year. You know, we've laid people off, we've cut costs. Everybody says, oh, we cut costs to the bone. There is no bone. There's no limit to productivity. And the key is not actually cost reduction. It's not overhead reduction. The key is creating a perpetual process of productivity gains. And, you know, when I hear management saying we're already down to the bone, we can't cut it, what I hear is we're looking at cost reduction, not productivity. So we need productivity gains without capital expenditure. That's a much tougher thing to do. It comes from 1,000 particles, 1,000 little things, all on the front line. And most of the understanding how you achieve that comes from the people who work for you. Our deputy chairman at Asda was a man called Sir Ian Gibson that who Tony knows well. He's a marvellous guy who's now chairman of Morrison's. We'll forgive him that. But he started the first brand new car plant to be built in Britain in Sunderland for Nissan. He was the senior non-Japanese at Nissan. And I went round his car plant. I said to him, can I come round your car plant? And he said, why do you want to do that? It's not very much like a supermarket. I said, no, but you don't realise it probably is. And of course it is. He had the highest productivity car plant in Europe at the time. And almost all the productivity gains in Nissan came from the front line. So all the standards, everything you did in putting together the car was built by the work teams. And their creators of a perpetual productivity machine. And I always remember him showing me that one of the standards was how you put putting a, what do you call it, a nut on a wheel hub. And he said, this is a detail. He said, what we've defined is this, not just a standard which says you now put the nut on the wheel hub. It's which fingers of which hand you pick the nut up and how you turn it into the screw. And that is productivity, because that's defining things down to the tiny details that really make the difference. And if you can get people on the front line to embrace those things, then you'll define yourself into perpetual progress. What that's to do with is, as much as anything else, is motivation. You see, it goes back to my earlier point. We think that we've taken motivation out of management. We think we're in a post-people era. We think we've gone, now it's all IT, it's all systems. Actually, most of our businesses are more to do with people than they've ever been. We're more labour intensive than we've ever been. Whether it's in banking, whether it's in recruitment, whether it's in technology and software development, we're much more dependent upon the skill, motivation and appetite of our people than we were 20 years ago. And retailing, you know, where I work, we are the most old-fashioned industry anywhere. 70% of our costs in supermarketing is people. No, 30% roughly is labour. Well, there's a bit of technology and so on thrown in. But most of what we do is to do with our people. And yet, if you look at people, retail workers, who are mostly doing fairly rudimentary things that involve just manual dexterity, the difference in productivity is stupendous. So a fast shelf filler in a supermarket will be over 40% faster than a slow one. A fast checkout operator at Asda used to do 25 items a minute. A slow one does 12 items a minute. That's double. And what's the difference between fast and slow? It's motivation, it's manual dexterity, appetite for the job. And what's more, the slow operator, guess what's happening? Queues are building up, stress. So I don't serve people well, I don't have time to talk. The fast operator is chatting away, smiling, whizzing things through. So all I'm saying is motivation is the key to productivity. You select the right people, motivate them the right way, and in times like this, in the tough times, managing motivation is more important, not less. But what most businesses do today is they go all financial. Nobody goes into cost ratios, cut the costs, no hiring, and it's all negative. Whereas actually what we need to do is making sure the morale of the people we've got is high, their commitment to the business is high, and that they're searching to find the product to work harder, faster and smarter, because that's what we're going to depend on. And I want to come on beyond that to recognition, because the other thing we do right now is that because we've gone all financial, we've forgotten about motivation. But also, in the last few years, we came to think of motivation as to do with money. And I do think, it's a hobby horse of mine, in this country, we've become overly dominated by financial services. Now, we behaved as if investment banking was business. So, and private equity is part of this too. I mean, Tony, I don't know whether you feel, because we've come to assume that people don't do anything unless they're paid for it. Unless I'm going to get a bonus, that's got an incentive. And I have this problem, even in Australia, I have managers at Coles who say, we've really got to give all the department managers a new incentive. We've got to give the deli managers a bonus. Actually, that's not what it's about. What it's about is recognition. Most people don't work in the transactional, incentive-based culture we as managers think they live in. Most people value fairness at work, a good basic rate of pay, a decent workplace where they're recognised for who they are and given some self-esteem, and the opportunity to develop themselves. They value that far more than pay and bonuses. In fact, most bonus schemes I see in retail companies create more dissonance on the shop floor, more energy, more sense of unfairness than they do extra energy and motivation. Now, I'm not saying I'm against them. All I'm saying is we've got into this sort of fashionable era where we thought that's what it's all about. Now, a lot of our companies I'm involved, we can't pay a bonus. We ain't going to be paying a bonus, in some businesses for a long time to come. The share options are underwater. We've lost that. That bit of our armour is gone. So we might as well recognise it wasn't very effective anyway. And it's to do with a transactional investor-manager culture. It's not to do with the shop floor culture. What matters on the shop floor is recognition and workplace community. For most people in a supermarket, 70% of your people are part-time working women. Work is an intimidating place to them. For a lot of them, it's the first ever job. So creating a workplace where they feel welcome, they feel part of it, they're talked to by their Christian name, their boss treats them with respect, that is far, far more important. And I may tell you too, it's far more difficult to achieve. So it gives you a uniqueness if you can. Why did we end up at Asda with lower labour turnover and lower absenteeism than any of our food retail competitors? It wasn't due to our pay. Our pay was less than Sainsbury's and Tesco and Safeway. It was to do with the workplace culture. And the last thing I'd say on this is recognise too that at times like this, what really affects people is their working hours, the wages, the uncertainty about their colleagues being dismissed or made redundant. That is pretty heavy stuff. That is very, very corroding to the workplace. And it's for us as managers to cope with that and lead people through it. People are much more intimidated by the workplace and by the management than we think they are. And most people in many of the places we work, certainly in a supermarket, work for that, come to work for us with low self-esteem. It's one of the things you battle against. If you end up as a checkout operator at Asda, you probably don't think that was a great achievement in life. But it can be a great achievement, and it's our job to make it an achievement and something worthwhile. I always remember, I may have told Tony this before, but when I was relatively new as chief executive at Asda, I used to go around the stores and chat to people. And I went to Rawtenstall in Lancashire, which actually was quite a high trade union store. I mean, we had some issues there. And I was bouncing along as chief executive, and I went to the checkout operators. I went to the checkout operator and said, how do you find it working here? And she said, well, not very good, really. So I said, oh, why is that then? And she said, you've got to understand that when I was at school and I didn't do my homework, my teacher said to me, if you don't do your homework, you'll end up as a checkout operator at Asda. And here I am. So that's the real problem, because you've got to lift that person up to believing that what they thought and were told at school was a failure is a success. And we've got to enable that person to feel proud of what they do, that they're an outstanding checkout operator, they got recognition for it, they're part of a worthwhile community, doing something worthwhile for their friends, family and neighbours and for the community as a whole. And that is the challenge. And part of it is to do with, of course, massive recognition. I just believe you can't overdose. You know, most bonus schemes pay out on about, in a good year, about 30% of, in retail, 30% of people get a bonus or whatever. So by definition, 70% don't. So that's what you've achieved. You know, you start off with a point, 70% of people are demotivated. Recognition is for free. And if you can give people huge recognition around the business, if it's undeserved, it's fine. Nobody resents it. If it's deserved, it's personal. It really means something. When I first went to Asda, we had lots of directors who didn't do terribly well. And so over the first 2 years, they left. And unfortunately, we had this company car scheme where they all leased expensive Jaguars. And they went in for Jaguars. I don't know why they did, but that was sort of the Asda thing. And so we were left with these Jaguars. So what we decided to do with them was give them away to colleagues who worked in the stores. So we ran this thing called a VPI scheme, and anybody could sponsor an item in the store. And if they drove the sales up that month, at the end of the month, we'd judge who'd done the best thing. And they'd come up to Asda House, as these people did. No, they did something with Kellogg's chocolate squares, I think. And they get the keys to the Jaguar, which I would then hand over. Tony, presumably you do the same. And it's a great moment because here they come up, they get the keys to Jaguar, they drive it down, they park it on the drive, the neighbour looks over the fence and thinks, cool, blimey, they've had a promotion. And so it was a great thing. It was part of, you know, you can have part of what the bosses used to have. And the only problem is the repair bills were something horrendous. And eventually all these Jags were finished, so we had to go and buy some more. So what was initially a low-cost scheme became a very high-cost scheme. The last thing I'd say is about communication. And I know this, you know, sounds like motherhood, but businesses don't communicate well. You know, Alan Layton used to say communication's an unnatural act in management, and I think he's right. And the trouble is that what we do is we decide, yes, it's tough times, so we've got to communicate. So we always go to the corporate communications department or the HR department, and they produce a company magazine. And it's all glossy, and it goes flying around all the employees, and 70% of them are at the bin. One reason being because it's all management speak. It's their agenda, not ours. It's not a proper workplace agenda. The other reason is because actually people don't read things. No, ordinary working people don't. You're lucky if they read a newspaper, let alone a corporate magazine. And so communication isn't about that. It's not about megaphone. Communication now is about getting the line to communicate, eyeball to eyeball. In other words, it's eyeball, not email. And that's what really matters in people's lives. So if you can get people before the shift comes on in the morning to have a 2-minute huddle in which they say, look, you know, Betty hasn't been able to come in today because she's unwell. We've got this promotion on, we really got to get behind it. We've got a bit of a problem, you know, with the technology systems down on this checkout or whatever. Oh, and by the way, the chairman's just resigned. You know, if you can say that and it's in your face, then that's worth 1,000 corporate magazines, videos, etc. And it's about getting the line to talk. And in times like this, what you find is that people go invisible. Now, I worked many years ago as at McKinsey in a factory where we were making 30% of people redundant. And the lists of people who were going to be made redundant were read out. And some of them were absent or they were working, so they came over the tannoy. Large numbers of people in that factory just disappeared to the canteen, to the loo, to anywhere, just thinking perhaps they could, if they weren't there, they'd avoid it. That's what happens. When things are rough, people go invisible and the line just disappears. Or they hide behind lists and email. And you've got to force the line to get out up front, be with your people. After all, you know, typically the management are suffering as much as the individuals on the shop floor. And the last thing I'd say is manage the informal network. You've no idea how in your businesses, the informal network is always more powerful than the formal network. So you may think you control the communication, but you don't. It's the gossip vine that controls the communication. It's what people say to each other. And it's even more difficult than that now, because I went into a store in Coles in Australia the other day, and in the staff canteen on the whiteboard, it said, join Facebook group Coles Fitzroy. And I thought, I'll join that. Then, of course, I apply to join, and the answer is no. So you're getting, now you even get these electronic groups, which are communicating without us, and we can't get into it. So thinking about how do I control that? How do I get the eyeball to eyeball, Daily Miller, straight in your face communication, and how do I control the grapevine? It's really challenging and really interesting, but very, very important, because that's a big part of your communications world and store community. So what I think we're in is not, in a way, we are in a recession, but we'll come out of the recession. It's not the recession that matters, it's the aftermath. Look at this not as a blip, but a landscape change. Assume it's going to be like this forever, and you'll get things roughly right. Treat it as if you just arrived. So you're a new chief executive and do the things that a new chief executive would do. And manage people so that you worry more about the motivation, more about the recruitment, more about the communication, more about the productivity and the recognition you can hand out than you've ever done before in your life. And I think then you stand a chance of getting it roughly right. So I'm not saying things won't improve. I think there are great fortunes to be made in the next few years. But an awful lot of people will get it completely wrong. And this is more about good old-fashioned intensive management, people and leadership, than it's ever been. And I always like this quote, although I'm not sure I understand what it says. A leader is best when people barely know he exists, not so good when people obey and proclaim him. Failure to honour people, they fail to honour you. But a good leader who talks little, when his work is done, his aim fulfilled, they will all say, we did this ourselves. There are no monuments in business leadership. Nobody puts a statue up to the chief executive. You pass on. What matters is what you leave behind. And if people believe that they created it, then you'll create something truly sustainable. See, people come to work to shine, and our job is to make them shine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Archie, and I'm so glad you didn't get off at Doncaster this evening. So, we're really glad to have you here. Really thoughtful speech there. I'm sure we've got lots of questions coming up from the floor. Who'd like to start? Gentlemen.
Thanks, Archie. That was fabulous. One of the things we really try to do in our business is recruit for attitude, and I find it one of the toughest things always to spot through the recruitment process. Have you got any magic tips as to how to spot attitude through the recruitment process?
I think it's intuitive, and I think if you have a strong culture, the culture will recognise the culture, the attitude. I once went to Super Quinn in Ireland, which was then in those days run by Fergal Quinn, who started it. And they had 40 stores around Dublin. And they recruited everybody centrally, including the checkout operator, everybody. And I said, that's fantastic, Fergal. I said, do you have some, how do you do it? And he said, well, I've got this guy, he does it all, and there's a little recruitment centre. So I said, can I go and see it? So we went along to see it. And I found this guy in his office, and I said, you must have some amazing psychographic test, or, how do you... And he said, no, he said, it's very simple. He said, when people come here, I have to recruit lots of people, he said, I can't interview them for very long. So when people come here, they come to the front doorbell and they press the button, and it's a speakerphone thing, and the receptionist answers, and then she invites them up and they sit in reception for 5 minutes. He said, after 5 minutes, I call them down the corridor. They come down the corridor, they knock on the door, and they come in and sit down. By the time they sat down, I know whether I want them or not. And of course, he's exaggerating, but what he meant was he and the receptionist, they see who this person is, their attitude and their confidence. And I think that's, extreme. But we used to do we used to have group interviews at Asda. We used to get people to come and walk the stores as a group first, see who interacted. Because you're looking for people with confidence, who are sociable. At the end of the day, if you're a service business, the world is divided between people who are happy and laugh and smile and people who are, miserable. And, there's nothing wrong with being miserable. Some of the best people are miserable, but they need to go and be, bricklayers or chemical engineers, or there are probably some of those in here. And don't come and work at Asda. You want happy people. And so I don't think there is a scientific way to do it. The other thing that we found in the later years very good is to get people to group friends and relatives. And it's a very good thing. And although there's a danger that it becomes sort of incestuous and nepotistic, actually it's a really reinforcing thing to do. If I persuade my friend to come and work in my store and he or she's been accepted and now we're working together, that I feel pretty good about that.
Okay, please.
Hi, my name is Rohit Madhav. Thank you for your presentation. You are the youngest partner at McKinsey. What leadership attributes did you use to manage that?
Oh, well, McKinsey, a firm of management consultants, and I think it's a wonderful, wonderful firm. I mean, it's many times bigger, more successful than I was there now, but it's not really a leadership. A leadership is different in a professional firm like that. You were leading very small teams of very highly motivated, very bright people, and you didn't have to persuade people at McKinsey to work hard or to be motivated. I think, I'll tell you one thing I did think. I think what is McKinsey is relatively unique about is that they're like a university. People who work at McKinsey never leave, so they become alumni. And like all professional firms, because they're a pyramid, there has to be an up or out. So when you join McKinsey, you're told that something like 7 out of 8 people who join will leave in 5 years. They have to. And so only 1 in 8 is going to make partner. And yet, there's absolutely no sense of dishonour in leaving. In fact, departures are celebrated. And I think that's very important to the system because it creates a non-competitive system in which people just want to succeed, they want to be part of the firm, and when they leave, they want to bring business back to the firm. And too many of us, in businesses, when somebody comes to leave, it's a part of business life. People leave. Instead of celebrating their contribution and asking them to stay in touch, we sort of shuffle them out the back door and tell them to leave the car keys behind. But I think leadership in McKinsey is relatively easy. Obviously, the client work is something different. I left McKinsey because I never really intend to be there that long. But the trouble with being a management consultant is fascinating work. But there's always a meeting after you've left, and that's the real one, when the decision is made.
Please.
Hi, I'm Darren Hesketh, Diamond Electronics. Currently, there's organisations like BA who are asking people to take salary cuts and, in fact, no salary for a period of time, as opposed to, I guess, wholesale redundancies. What's your view on the different ways people are looking at the challenge of headcount and turnover?
Well, I think BA have I don't really understand the BA situation, probably somebody here does, but I think they have a real cash problem, and this is to try and get them through a period. I think you can ask people to do that. I think you could ask people to make extraordinary sacrifices as long as you've got the preconditions, which is that they believe in you as more than an employer. They want the institution to succeed. Even today, people are very, especially down south, they're very transactional about their work. And if you're not going to pay them, a lot of them will say, I'm going to work somewhere else. But if they believe in the institution, they believe in the way they're treated, they believe in what you're trying to achieve more broadly, then I think you can get people to do extraordinary things like that. I rather doubt whether those conditions are there at BA, because they're seem to have this horrendous record on industrial relations, but other people know more about that. At Asda, my first year, we weren't a good employer when I joined. It was not a great place to work. It was pretty depressing, grotesquely hierarchical, etc. But even then, people sort of knew they wanted the business to succeed. They felt the heart was still beating. They knew what it should be like. And in our first year, we had a wage and salary freeze from top to bottom of the company, even though all our competitors were giving wage increases. And we put that to vote. We had to then because of the GMB, the union. And we had overwhelming support for it. So I think you can make those things work. And if you've got, obviously there's no point in keeping people in work if it's non-sustainable. You want to get down to the sustainable core as fast as you can. But then I do think you can ask people to make sacrifices. You've got the preconditions. What I do think is a great mistake, and all of us do it, is when you come into a recession or downturn, we never make the final cut, the first cut. We always go in stages, and it's agony. It always takes you, make 5% of the people redundant, and then you figure out that's not going to be enough, and another 5%, and then you get into this syndrome of everybody, you say this is the last one and nobody believes you, etc. So I do think it's important, if you can't afford to have people, then let's face into it. And
I had the privilege to meet you 16 years ago. Andy Bond introduced me to you. And,
I don't think it was quite that long ago, was it?
It is, I'm sorry. I was only 28. By the way. I think you were in the late 30s, but it was quite amazing, really, that I got the opportunity to meet you. I had a bread business, and you were a very busy man, and you gave me an hour of your time.
No, that's because you had a better bakery business than ours.
Obviously, the pitch wasn't great. But what amazed me was when I went to Asda, I saw everybody walking around with, their names. Everybody knew who everybody was, and also you had some initiatives, Tell Archie, and also what really blew me away was you sat in an office, open plan office, and you were really accessible. With Coles, what is your latest initiatives to inspire them? What new initiatives that could inspire others in this room?
Well, Coles we're 100% open plan now. We've disposed of all the security in the head office. I hate these head offices where you get arrested twice on the way in. I think it's all pointless. It's it's Australian anyway, so it's quite informal. But we're in phase one in Coles. We made 1,600 people redundant in the head office a year ago, so we're still in quite an early stage. So, and some of the things you're referring to, when I come back to my point about time and place, when you're in the tough phase, you do the tough things, and then after that you can start having your motivational ideas and so on, and Ian McLeod, who's the chief executive there, has a sort of Tell Archie like suggestion scheme, and so on. Incidentally, quick word on suggestion schemes is we ran at Asda, and Tony I think did the same. We had the biggest suggestion scheme in Britain. I answered far more letters from colleagues at Asda than I had ever answered from constituents when I was in Parliament. I did a lot of letters to constituents. The rule was anybody who writes to the boss gets a reply from the boss. Because what matters with suggestions is not the reward. It's the fact that somebody takes your idea seriously enough to say you get a reply from the chief executive, signed by the chief executive. And if you look, you're all thinking about, I better have a suggestion scheme. My advice is don't. They're very, very hard work. They usually fail. And you know how it is when you go into a head office somewhere and by the reception they have this little box with suggestions and slips you put in, and you look in the box and what do you see? About 3 suggestions and 2 bits of chewing gum. And at the end of the month or once a year, the HR department empty them out on a table, and then they give a completely ridiculous reward to the best suggestion, which creates enormous resentment because everybody says, I thought of that a year before. They really don't work unless you put huge investment in them, because what you're trying to do is not actually reward suggestions. You're trying to create a lot of recognition for people's efforts to improve the business in whatever way. And 90% of the suggestions are pretty useless. But somebody's made the effort to write, put pen to paper, which they normally do, because they feel strongly enough you can do something different for the business. And if they do that, they deserve a reply. And and we used to give out 30% of the suggestions got some sort of keyring or pen or just something to say thank you. But I don't think, one of the things with Asda is that, in a way, I always worry about it slightly because I think we became famous for gimmicks, like suggestion schemes and Jaguars and open plan offices and so on. But the point is there's a hard sort of ideology behind it, which is this business, in a people business, you've got to treat people with equal respect. It's single status. There's nobody more important than anybody else. We pay people differently because they're market worth. But the chief executive is not a more important person than the office cleaner. We're on the same level. And incidentally, open plan, all my businesses are open plan. And it's entirely selfish. It probably is a good idea, but I like it because I'm a very noisy person. I like to sit in the middle of people and I can hear what's going on, and everybody else suffers as a consequence. But I can't stand these offices. You go in today and you go into these office buildings and they have a lovely glass building and all the senior people sit with views and glass walls on the outside, and 2/3 of the employees sit in inner darkness on the inside. What's that about? The people you want to have daylight and have a fantastic working environment, they should be on the outside. But Coles is Australia. It's a great place to work. This is my advertisement. Anybody wants to go to Australia? It's a great place to work. It's a much stronger economy than ours. It's a young country. Coles will be the biggest turnaround story in world food retailing, and it's on track. We've got a fantastic team. It's a great brand. If I didn't have things to do here, I would be there full time.
Okay, please.
Hi, Archie. How do you ensure motivation is sustainable in the long term? I know, you can bring in suggestions, you can go actually motivation in the short term, but how do you ensure it's a long-term thing rather than just a short-term motivational bit?
I think you've got to build it into the culture and line of the business. So every manager in your business knows that his success in recruiting and motivating his team is something you measure and you're interested in, and it's critical to his success. So you can't get promoted unless you are a motivating manager and you worry about it. And people can learn to do it. So one of the simple things we did at Asda is to have what we call a We're Listening survey, which measures the motivation and attitude in every store at least once a year. So we have 12 stores every month. 1/12 of the stores every month, so it rolls through the system. And you find most businesses, modern business today, do employee attitude surveys. Most of them are done by some sort of outside agency or the HR department. And most of them produce a result once a year which is mildly unacceptable. And it arrives on the chief executive's desk and he looks at it and thinks, well, that's not that good. And it goes in the bottom drawer and is forgotten about. In other words, it's market research for the board. That's useless. What you've got to do is make it a metric of performance for the manager. So if the store gets a bad We're Listening survey, that's a problem for the store manager. It's a problem because the chief executive is going to be on the phone. What can we do to help? It's a problem because you're going to get another survey in 3 months' time. It's a problem because the results are actually going to be published in the store, so everybody who works there sees they've got a relatively bad survey. So everybody in the store wants to do something about it. It's embarrassing. So what I'm saying is that's one example. Build it into the system so that motivating people isn't something you just do, on an anniversary or at Christmas or when somebody has a birthday party. It's not something you just do when we just achieved our sales results. Actually, it matters rather more when we haven't achieved our sales results. So it's got to be in the system. You've got to managers who lead from the front, or out on the shop floor. You know, what I can't stand is the sort of, you know, the manager who sits in his office barking orders, or what you classically get in retail is the, you know, the sort of syndrome of the board visit and the entourage. And in other words, management becomes intimidating instead of releasing. You know, I remember it in the old days. You know, you think back to the days of John Sainsbury or Richard Greenbury at Marks and Spencer. They used to go store visiting in a chauffeur-driven limousine with their staff in the back. So, you know, the big Mercedes draws up outside the front door, doors flung open. You know, out gets the big suit, surrounded by 3 other people with notepads. And what do? They go around and inspect the store. Yeah? Net result is everybody breathes a big sigh of relief when they're gone. Yeah? That's not motivating, that's intimidating. And it doesn't achieve anything. We all have in our businesses, you've got a line management who do that. You know, we all got people who go around inspecting stores, and that's their job. But the top management has got to set an example. And the example is to get people to talk to you, tell you what's really going on. So our practice, you know, would be that the rule at Asda is you park in the furthest car parking space away from the front entrance. Why? Because the good spaces are for the customers. You walk across the car park. What do you do when you walk across the car park? Pick up the litter. It's always litter. Pick up the litter. You arrive at the front door with litter. What do you do with the litter? You put it in the waste paper bin. I promise you people will notice. Yeah? And then we had these mobile microphones. So you borrow a mobile microphone at the front desk. First thing you do, you say, "Good morning, everybody. It's Archie Norman here. I'm the chairman of Asda. I'm visiting the store. I'm going to be in the store for the next half hour. I'd love to hear what you think of our store, and if there's anything I do to help, I'd love to do that. But the first thing I just want to say is a huge thank you to all our colleagues who do such a fantastic job for us in the store." And everybody in the store hears that, and the store manager, feet on his desk in his office, thinks, "Bloody hell," and comes running down. So motivation has to start. You have to start from the top, and you've got to be able to listen. And in retail, listening is the biggest challenge. You know, so many managers just don't have the capacity to hear what people are really saying. You're a chief executive, you've got to be able to go around that store and get people to tell you what's wrong and why it's wrong. If they don't tell you, then you'll never ever know. But getting them to talk means you've got to be on their level. And they've got to feel that if they report a problem, it's going to be acted upon, something's going to happen. And I think the age of hierarchy is dead. Managers don't have legitimacy just because they're called managers. Your legitimacy because what you do for people and how effective you are in leading and motivating them.
You mentioned a couple of times trade unions, and all the stuff I've heard here is really about direct engagement. Can you explain how you successfully reconciled those two streams?
Yes, we had a bit of a shock, you see. When I arrived, I didn't really notice this. Well, I knew there was the trade union. I knew that 81% of our people were members of it. It was the GMB. But I didn't really take it very seriously. And in our first year, we had this wage and salary freeze, and we made quite a lot of people redundant. And we closed down a meat plant we had, and that the union were quite difficult about that, I think quite rightly, actually. But then the next year, we had this recognition agreement, and we put, to cut a long story short, we put a wage deal to the union, which they agreed to, and then they put it to the vote, and it was turned down. Anyway, we went round the houses, and they ended up calling a strike. It's what unions do. I mean, they turned down the deal. I mean, it's an odd thing, because the leadership agreed, but the shop stewards turned down. And we just never thought this would happen. It was inconceivable. But all of a sudden, we had a strike call. And they was going to a ballot for our own people as to go on strike. And So that was a huge wake-up call. It was a wake-up call for us because understanding, all of a sudden we had, life depended on getting people to vote this down. And so we had, as we learned about communication pretty fast then. So we had a massive communication exercise. We realised that we had to get on top of this. And the strike ballot was defeated by overwhelmingly, over 80%. And after that, I said, never again are we going to negotiate on pay with the union. And we tore up the agreement. They just lost this ballot, so there's nothing they could do. We tore up the agreement and we gave them a new agreement, which basically removed them from the pay bargaining system, which they quite liked because the pay bargaining created a huge problem every year of this sort of peculiar sort of balloting thing, which they did. The one thing that was really important to the union was membership. The membership for them, you remember for unions, membership is income. And income pays the full-time salaries and expenses of the professionals. And when the membership goes down, they have to make professionals redundant. So that was the one thing that was really important to them. And we were always respectful to them in that respect. They were entitled to recruit. We took them out of the induction process. Didn't really approve of that. But they were entitled to recruit. But I did regard it, and I still would regard it in most workplaces, if people have to give up some of their savings to join a union to protect themselves against their management, that gives me a problem. And it's not I'm anti-union, because I think a lot of unions do good work, but I am disappointed in a management that is perpetuating a system where people have to give up their money to join a union. And we had good relations with the union, but we did set out to reduce the union membership. Largely because of this, we regarded, it was a measure of were we succeeding in our motivation and management. And we ended up with, we think, we didn't really know, but we ended up around about 13% union membership. We introduced, we offered to pay people's legal insurance. So if they wanted to be insured against us mistreating them, then we would pay. I mean, that's really what people join the union for. And incidentally, a lot of the people in the early days in Asda, a lot of the union shop stewards were the best people we had. Some of them were very sort of negative, but some of them were people who should have come into management, really. They were looking for development in their careers.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more question, so please.
You mentioned having values to die for in your presentation. I just wondered, how do you keep those values alive?
Well, as I said, I think the most important thing is they have to come from the heart. They have to come from your people, not from the boardroom. I mean, you'd like to think that the two will coincide, but it's no good having boardroom values that don't mean anything in the workplace, because the purpose of them is to explain to your people why your organisation is a good thing. And most of us are blessed in that we work for companies that actually are trying to do something good and we really do believe in. Now, some people probably have to work for, I don't know, Imperial Tobacco or something. That's a bit more difficult. But, most of us do work for, and we do believe in what we're doing. And finding a way of sharing that and articulating with people is what really matters. And then making sure you live the values and you express the values in the way you employ people and the way they work together. You talk about what you've achieved. To take an example at Asda, part of our thing was obviously meeting the needs of ordinary working people and their families to demand value. So we were looking to make life affordable for people who lived on a budget. And so we would look to do things like take luxuries like smoked salmon, take an example, and crash the price and make it affordable for people. And that led on to finding ways of what we call value crusading. Things that, like the net book agreement, was a way of fixing book prices so that people couldn't afford to buy books and read less. We thought that was a pretty bad idea, so we broke the net book agreement, and eventually it was abolished. On over-the-counter medicines, a lot of over-the-counter medicines have an 80% manufacturing margin. I mean, they're a rip-off, really, and the own label, the generic version, is half the price and just as good. So we cut the price of things like paracetamol and got into terrible trouble with the suppliers, and they withdrew supply, and it was all over the press, and that was fantastic. But it's a way of saying to your people, look, we're campaigning our own values. This is what we believe in. And those are the sort of things your own people can get very involved with. It doesn't have to be just sort of charitable giving and community involvement. That's good stuff to do, but it is also in the way you conduct your trade. So you bring the values through and you tell people you're doing that. And the more you can get your own people involved in campaigning the values and talking about them, customers and friends and family, then the more it becomes real.